Most of us don't realize that 40% of our food source ultimately comes from tiny organisms called plankton that live near the surface of the ocean. When you think about it, this is huge. We often use the word plankton in a very generic way. But what are these guys? Really, what are they? Well, let's find out. The word plankton does not refer to a single organism, but rather it's a word we use to describe organisms at the bottom of the food chain. It's derived from the Greek meaning to wander or drift, and in fact that's what plankton do. They drift in the ocean currents and have limited or no ability to swim against a current. But what about those that do swim? If we restrict ourselves to the ocean environment, we can classify these organisms as follows. Plankton are the drifters, as we've mentioned. Nekton is another organism that has the ability to swim against currents, while benthos are those that inhabit the ocean floor or burrow in the seafloor. Within the plankton group, we have phytoplankton that are able to produce their own food through photosynthesis. We also call them primary producers. Zooplankton, on the other hand, cannot make their own food and must eat plankton or other zooplankton to survive. Bacterioplankton are another type of microscopic plankton group that may either photosynthesize or not. We have some more terminology that we use for plankton since some organisms have two stages in their lives and may start out as planktonic larvae, yet they transition into a benthos or nekton as an adult. We call these meroplankton, and we can also have haloplankton for those organisms that retain their planktonic form as adults. Now, plankton come in many shapes and sizes, and it's often surprising to know just how big they can get. As you can see, some of the largest plankton can get to be 20 centimeters in size and constitute the jellies, salps, and cephalopods, while some of the smallest are microscopic. The two smallest groups include the bacteria and marine viruses. We'll start our series of plankton by looking at phytoplankton. In other words, those organisms that produce their own food through photosynthesis. And it could be that 40% of our food source is created from phytoplankton. So how do we actually measure photosynthesis? We do this through something we call primary productivity, which is a measure of the total amount of organic material or living tissue produced by photosynthesis. It's actually measured in terms of grams of carbon made into organic material or tissue per square meter of the whole ocean column. And to no one's surprise, primary productivity is more efficient in the ocean than on land. As expected, if we alter the available nutrients or sunlight in the water, then the productivity will change accordingly. Now let's look at some of the common varieties of phytoplankton. The largest group are diatoms that have silica-based rigid cell walls with perforations. They have two valves called frustules that resemble petri dishes that slip over one another. They're very efficient at photosynthesis, and up to 55% of the sunlight they capture is converted to glucose. They use chlorophyll or xanthophyll in photosynthesis. And diatoms have an oil or fat globule in their cells that enable them to float and drift along in the ocean. Dinoflagellates are an unusual type of plankton. Some are photosynthetic, phytoplankton, but other species are non-photosynthetic, which makes them a zooplankton. Some live in the water column, while others inhabit the seafloor sediments as benthos. Dinoflagellates have whips to move about, and they're responsible for the red tides when their populations explode. These red tides are actually toxic to many small fish, and some types of dinoflagellates bioluminesce or glow in the dark. To do this, they release a chemical called luciferin, which is a derivative of chlorophyll that becomes oxidized by enzymes. And this process excites the electrons in the atoms to a higher energy level. And when they drop their energy level, they emit a beautiful luminescent light. Another common single-celled phytoplankton are coccolithophores that belong to the protist kingdom. These coccolithophores have calcareous scales called coccoliths that make up their exoskeleton. And when they die, they settle to the bottom of the ocean floor and can build up very large chalky deposits, like the White Cliffs of Dover. They can also produce their own blooms, but are generally not harmful. Silicoflagellates are phytoplankton that belong to the chromist kingdom. These plankton have silica-based skeleton. Not all photosynthesize, and some combine photosynthesis with the ingestion of prey, which means that some varieties can be considered zooplankton. Now, bacterioplankton are also sometimes called picoplankton, given their minute size, and these are primarily bacteria or blue-green algae that belong to the bacteria kingdom. These organisms are probably responsible for generating the oxygen that filled our early atmosphere, since they are thought to account for 70% of all the photosynthetic activity. However, not all of them photosynthesize. Bacterioplankton are one of the more successful groups on Earth because of their sheer numbers, geographic coverage, and longevity in the geologic record. Now, if you have bacteria, then we also have to mention marine viruses at the femtoplankton level. And although they're not truly phytoplankton, they're worth mentioning since they're often parasitic to phytoplankton. To give you an idea of just how small they are, you might have 250 million viruses in only one drop of seawater. Now, if we add up all the viruses on Earth, you'd get around 1 nonillion viruses. That's a 1 followed by 30 zeros. To give you an idea of how enormous these numbers are, if you took all the tiniest plankton on Earth, which we call femtoplankton, and most of them are actually viruses, and we lined them up side by side, your line would extend 200 million light years. If that's not huge, I don't know what is. There's so much to learn about plankton, and we've just gotten started. In fact, plankton are responsible for most of the air we breathe. In our next episode, we're going to look at zooplankton, and these are the truly carnivorous kind. This is Mike Kozik for My Science Blast.